The village of Willowbrook possessed the kind of peace that strangers often mistook for innocence. Its narrow lanes curved gently between hedgerows thick with hawthorn and elderflower. Roses climbed sleepily across cottage walls. The church bells of St. Jude sounded every quarter hour with such dependable calm that even the sparrows seemed to organize their lives accordingly. On the afternoon of the annual parish fete, the village green shimmered beneath a pale June sun. White bunting fluttered lazily between chestnut trees, and little tables had been arranged in neat rows beside the vicarage lawn. Elderly ladies in floral hats dispensed sponge cakes with grave importance, while children darted among the stalls trailing shrieks and sticky fingers. It was precisely the sort of gathering Miss Jane Marple enjoyed. She sat beneath a striped parasol near the tea-table, knitting something soft and blue, though her needles moved more slowly than usual because she was listening. Miss Marple always listened. 3 sugars, announced Miss Eyes. Finch loudly, passing a cup across the table to Colonel Harbury. Positively scandalous at your age. The Colonel grunted amiably. Beyond them, the church choir attempted a patriotic song with uneven enthusiasm. Near the raffle-stand, Mr. Leonard Pike, the solicitor, was speaking in low tones to Dr. Edward Blackwell, the village physician. Both men wore expressions of careful politeness that seemed just slightly strained. Miss Marple noticed this at once. People rarely understood how much could be discovered from politeness. "You are observing them again," said a voice beside her. Miss Marple looked up with a smile. Lucy Dane, the vicar's niece, lowered herself into the neighboring chair, carrying 2 cups of tea. She was 28, intelligent, and possessed of the unfortunate modern habit of speaking honestly. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "one always observes one's neighbours. It is the only practical way to live peacefully with them." Lucy laughed. "You sound rather dangerous when you say things like that." "Nonsense. I am merely old." That, Miss Marple knew, was among the greatest advantages imaginable. Lucy handed her a cup. "Have you seen Mrs. Ashcombe today?" Miss Marple paused very slightly. "No," she said. "I had expected to. So had everyone. She donated half the flowers." Lucy nodded toward the floral tent where elaborate arrangements of foxglove and peonies stood waiting for the judging. Mrs. Beatrice Ashcombe was one of Willowbrook's wealthiest residents. A widow of nearly 10 years, she lived alone in Ashcombe Hall at the edge of the village with only a housekeeper and occasional maid for company. She was admired publicly, disliked privately, and feared almost universally. "She quarrelled with Mr. Pike last week," Lucy added quietly. Mrs. Finch told Aunt Margaret she heard them through the post-office door. "Indeed, something about money." Miss Marple sipped her tea. Money, she reflected, was very like damp in old houses. Wherever it settled, unpleasant things eventually emerged. Across the lawn, the master of ceremonies was attempting to organize the judging of the Victoria Sponge competition. This involved considerable shouting and no discernible progress. The vicar, Reverend Julian Dane, moved anxiously through the crowd with the expression of a man expecting catastrophe but hoping it might politely delay itself until after tea. At 3:30 catastrophe arrived. It came in the form of Elsie Turner, the maid from Ashcombe Hall, running breathlessly across the green without a hat. Now in villages the absence of a hat on a respectable woman immediately suggested disaster. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Elsie reached the vicar first. "Oh, Reverend, please come quickly, oh, please." "What is it?" asked Reverend Dane sharply. "It's Mrs. Ashcombe, sir." The girl's face had gone a dreadful grey. "She's dead." The silence that followed spread outward like ripples in water. Somewhere nearby a teacup shattered. Miss Marple laid down her knitting. Ashcombe Hall stood a little apart from Willowbrook beneath a grove of beeches. It was a square Georgian house with long windows, and the faintly melancholy appearance common to homes where too few people lived among too many rooms. By the time Miss Marple arrived, having sensibly accepted a lift from Colonel Harbury, a small crowd had already formed outside the gates. Villagers possessed a profound respect for tragedy, provided they could witness it personally. Dr. Blackwell's motor-car stood in the drive. A police bicycle leaned beside the hedges. Inside the hall, the atmosphere smelled faintly of furniture polish and fear. Miss Marple removed her gloves carefully. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pollard, sat rigidly in the entrance hall, clutching smelling salts. "It's dreadful," she whispered. "Simply dreadful." "Yes," said Miss Marple kindly. "I am sure it is." Mrs. Pollard lowered her voice. "They say she was poisoned." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened almost invisibly. "Do they?" Before more could be said, Inspector Gerald Hewitt emerged from the study. He was a competent local officer with a practical face and an unfortunate tendency toward conclusions. He bowed politely. "Miss Marple." "Inspector, I'm afraid this is unpleasant business." "It usually is," said Miss Marple. The inspector cleared his throat. "Doctor, Blackwell believes the death occurred sometime after luncheon. Mrs. Ashcombe appears to have taken cyanide." Lucy Dane, pale but composed, stood nearby. "But surely not intentionally?" she asked. Inspector Hewitt hesitated. "That remains to be determined." Miss Marple glanced toward the study door. "And where was she found?" "In the morning-room." "Alone." Something in the inspector's answer interested her. "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. Inspector Hewitt looked faintly uncomfortable. "You perceive something?" "My dear Inspector, I merely notice things." He gave a brief nod. "Well, we shall know more shortly. There are one or two peculiarities." "Such as?" "The cupboard." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "What cupboard?" "The small cabinet beside the morning-room fireplace." Hewitt frowned. It had been locked from the outside. The morning-room was bright, elegant, and curiously cold despite the afternoon warmth. French windows stood open onto the garden. A half-finished cup of tea rested beside an armchair. Nearby, upon a Persian rug, lay Mrs. Beatrice Ashcombe. Death had sharpened her severe features into something almost bird-like. One hand remained curled near her throat. Dr. Blackwell stood near the mantelpiece. "Terrible business," he muttered. "Terrible." Miss Marple did not approach the body immediately. Instead, she looked around the room. Bookshelves, writing desk, Chinese porcelain spaniel upon the mantel, needlework basket untouched, everything neat, too neat. Then she saw the cupboard. It was narrow and painted cream, scarcely taller than a man's shoulder. One of those built-in Georgian cabinets designed for linens or household storage. The brass key still hung from the lock. Inspector Hewitt opened it. Inside were shelves stacked with folded tablecloths and boxes of candles. Nothing else. "Odd thing," said Hewitt. "Housekeeper claims it's usually never locked." Miss Marple peered thoughtfully into the cupboard. "How curious!" Dr. Blackwell gave a slight shrug. "Perhaps Mrs. Ashcombe locked it herself." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Perhaps." But there was something in her tone that made Lucy glance at her quickly. Inspector Hewitt folded his notebook. "We've already spoken with the servants. Mrs. Ashcombe received no visitors today." "No visitors?" repeated Miss Marple. "No one except Mr. Pike yesterday evening regarding legal matters." At the mention of the solicitor's name, Dr. Blackwell shifted slightly. Miss Marple noticed that too. "How very unfortunate," she murmured. The inspector continued. "There's also the matter of the missing letters." "What letters?" asked Lucy. According to the housekeeper, Mrs. Ashcombe kept private correspondence in her writing desk. Several papers appear to be gone. "A robbery?" Lucy suggested. Hewitt looked doubtful. "Nothing else was taken." Miss Marple wandered slowly toward the desk. People often imagined old ladies wandered aimlessly. It was one of civilization's most useful misconceptions. Upon the blotter lay a faint circular stain. A teacup. Beside it rested a single crumb of chocolate cake. Miss Marple bent slightly. "Inspector," she said gently, "did Mrs. Ashcombe enjoy sweets?" Hewitt blinked. "I believe so." "How fortunate." Lucy looked puzzled. "Fortunate." Miss Marple straightened. "My dear, one can learn a great deal from cake." No one answered that. Outside, thunder murmured faintly beyond the hills, though the sky remained clear above Willowbrook. Miss Marple turned once more toward the little locked cupboard, and though she said nothing further, a curious feeling had already begun to stir within her mind. Not about poison, not even about murder, but about concealment. For in her long experience people rarely locked empty cupboards unless they feared what others might imagine had once been hidden there. By the following morning Willowbrook had become a village transformed. Not outwardly, of course. The milk was delivered at precisely the usual hour. Curtains were drawn back upon tidy parlors. The butcher's boy still cycled recklessly along the lane, and Miss Weatherby still objected loudly to the quality of the strawberries at Carter's shop. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of village life there pulsed something feverish and electric. Murder had arrived, and murder, Miss Marple often reflected, affected English villages rather like a stone dropped into a duck pond. The ripples touched everyone eventually. By 10 o'clock the tea-room at the Bluebell Inn was crowded with speculation. "It was clearly suicide," declared Mrs. Finch, stirring her tea with unnecessary violence. "Women of that sort always come to unhappy ends." "What sort?" asked Lucy Dane. Mrs. Finch lowered her voice despite the fact that everyone could hear perfectly well. Rich widows. Lucy looked faintly amused. That narrows the matter considerably. Across the room, two elderly sisters whispered behind seed cake. Near the window, Colonel Harbury read the newspaper upside down while pretending not to listen. Miss Marple sat quietly beside the fire with her knitting. As usual, nobody minded speaking freely in front of her. That, she had discovered, was because elderly women occupied a peculiar social category somewhere between furniture and clergy. "Inspector Hewitt says poison was definitely involved," continued Mrs. Finch. Lucy shivered. "How dreadful!" "Well," said Mrs. Finch darkly, "there are whispers." "In Willowbrook?" asked Lucy innocently. "Surely not." Mrs. Finch ignored this. "They say Mrs. Ashcombe had enemies." "My dear Mrs. Finch," said Miss Marple gently, "everyone has enemies. The fortunate merely do not know it." The room fell briefly quiet. Miss Marple resumed knitting. "I remember a woman in St. Mary Mead," she continued conversationally, "who believed herself universally adored. Quite mistaken, poor soul. 3 people wanted to poison her, and 2 more hoped nature would save them the trouble." Colonel Harbury coughed suddenly into his newspaper. Lucy smiled despite herself. Before anyone could reply, the bell above the inn door rang sharply. Mr. Leonard Pike entered. Conversation stopped. The solicitor removed his gloves with deliberate calm, though his face appeared grayer than usual. He was a careful man in his early 50s, with silvering hair and the permanently cautious expression of someone accustomed to other people's secrets. "Morning," he said. Several villagers answered with exaggerated casualness. Mr. Pike approached the counter. Miss Marple observed him closely. Fear behaved differently in different people. Some became loud, others nervous. A few grew unnaturally precise. Mr. Pike belonged to the last category. "Terrible tragedy," he remarked to no one in particular. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. He turned. "Ah, Miss Marple, you knew Mrs. Ashcombe well?" "As solicitor, naturally." "And as a friend?" Something flickered briefly behind his eyes. "One doesn't exactly become friends with Beatrice Ashcombe." No one missed the use of her Christian name. Mrs. Finch leaned forward like a hunting dog scenting blood. "It's said you visited Ashcombe Hall yesterday evening." Mr. Pike stiffened. "I fail to see how that concerns anyone." "It concerns the police," said a calm voice from the doorway. Inspector Hewitt had entered unnoticed. The room immediately developed the unnatural silence unique to places where gossip has suddenly encountered authority. Hewitt nodded politely. Hewitt nodded politely. "Mr. Pike, perhaps a word?" The solicitor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course." They moved into the adjoining lounge. The instant the door closed, Mrs. Finch breathed triumphantly. "There now." Lucy frowned. "You really think he killed her?" "My dear Lucy, men murder women every day for money." "Women murder men quite frequently, too," said Miss Marple mildly. Mrs. Finch blinked. "Well, yes, but that's generally different somehow." Miss Marple hid a smile. Human beings, she reflected, possessed an extraordinary talent for distinguishing between crimes they understood and crimes they merely condemned. Late that afternoon Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane toward Ashcombe Hall. The weather had turned oppressive. Clouds pressed low over the countryside, and the air smelled faintly of approaching rain. At the lodge gate she encountered Elsie Turner, the maid, who appeared pale and exhausted. "Good afternoon, Elsie." The girl started. "Oh, Miss Marple, you've had a difficult time." "Yes, miss." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "You were fond of Mrs. Ashcombe?" Elsie hesitated. She could be hard. "That was not what I asked." The girl twisted her hands. "She was generous sometimes, but people upset her lately." "In what way?" Elsie glanced nervously toward the house. She'd been frightened. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Frightened of whom?" "I don't know exactly." Elsie lowered her voice. "There were letters. She'd burned some of them after reading. Others she locked away." "In the desk?" "No, miss." Miss Marple waited. "In the cupboard." There it was again. That absurd little cupboard. The locked cupboard in the morning-room? "Yes." Elsie swallowed. "She wouldn't let anyone touch it. Not after last month." "What happened last month?" The maid looked suddenly uncertain. "I don't rightly know. Only one evening I heard shouting." "Between Mrs. Ashcombe and whom?" "Mr. Pike." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "And afterward?" She locked the cupboard. A carriage passed slowly along the road, its wheels crunching gravel. Elsie stepped back anxiously. "I shouldn't say more. "My dear child," said Miss Marple gently, "people nearly always say more after deciding not to." A faint, unwilling smile crossed the girl's face. Then she whispered, "Mrs. Ashcombe said someone was trying to ruin her." Inside Ashcombe Hall the atmosphere had altered subtly overnight. Fear had become suspicion. Servants moved quietly. Doors closed softly. Even the grandfather clock in the entrance hall seemed to tick with unusual caution. Inspector Hewitt received Miss Marple in the library. "You're becoming involved again," he observed. "My dear Inspector, old women become involved merely by existing near excitement." Hewitt smiled reluctantly. "Well, there's excitement enough." He gestured toward a folder on the desk. "We've confirmed cyanide in the tea." "Administered how?" "Likely stirred into the cup shortly before death." "And suicide?" The inspector shook his head. "No trace of poison container. Besides, there are signs someone searched the desk after she died." Miss Marple sat down quietly. "And Mr. Pike? He admits visiting her yesterday evening." Hewitt frowned. "Apparently they quarreled over alterations to her will." "Who benefits?" "A niece in London. Some charitable institutions. A few servants." "No Mr. Pike?" "None." Miss Marple folded her hands. "That is inconvenient." The inspector looked at her sharply. "You think him innocent?" "My dear man, innocence and guilt are never quite as simple as motives." Hewitt sighed. "You sound exactly like my aunt. Then she is probably an intelligent woman." A constable entered carrying a small parcel. "Found this in the garden shed, sir." Inside lay several burned fragments of paper. Inspector Hewitt spread them carefully across the desk. Most were blackened beyond recognition, but one surviving line remained visible. "Can't allow the cupboard to be opened." The room became very still. Hewitt muttered softly, "Well?" Miss Marple looked at the fragment for a long moment. Not excitement, not triumph, something nearer sadness. "Human beings," she said quietly, "so often imagine the past remains safely hidden simply because a door is closed." The inspector looked up. "You think the cupboard contains the secret?" "No," said Miss Marple. She rose slowly. "I think the cupboard merely frightened someone enough to kill." Outside, thunder rolled once more across the distant hills, and in the upper corridor of Ashcombe Hall, entirely unnoticed, a door opened very softly before closing again. Rain arrived over Willowbrook during the night. By morning the village glistened beneath a dull silver sky, every hedge dripping steadily into the lanes. The roses around the vicarage bowed beneath the weight of water, and the churchyard paths had become treacherously soft underfoot. Miss Marple liked rainy mornings. Rain had a way of slowing people down, and when people slowed down they often revealed themselves. She sat in the drawing-room of the vicarage with a tray of correspondence beside her and a small coal fire burning despite the season. Lucy Dane occupied the opposite chair, attempting unsuccessfully to read a magazine. "You are thinking," Lucy accused suddenly. "My dear, at my age one is either thinking or sleeping." "Occasionally both." Lucy smiled faintly but remained troubled. "I keep wondering about Mrs. Ashcombe. She cannot have been happy." Miss Marple looked at the fragment for a long moment. Not excitement, not triumph, something nearer sadness. "Human beings," she said quietly, "so often imagine the past remains safely hidden simply because a door is closed." The inspector looked up. "You think the cupboard contains the secret?" "No," said Miss Marple. She rose slowly. "I think the cupboard merely frightened someone enough to kill." Outside, thunder rolled once more across the distant hills, and in the upper corridor of Ashcombe Hall, entirely unnoticed, a door opened very softly before closing again. Rain arrived over Willowbrook during the night. By morning the village glistened beneath a dull silver sky, every hedge dripping steadily into the lanes. The roses around the vicarage bowed beneath the weight of water, and the churchyard paths had become treacherously soft underfoot. Miss Marple liked rainy mornings. Rain had a way of slowing people down, and when people slowed down they often revealed themselves. She sat in the drawing-room of the vicarage with a tray of correspondence beside her and a small coal fire burning despite the season. Lucy Dane occupied the opposite chair, attempting unsuccessfully to read a magazine. "You are thinking," Lucy accused suddenly. "My dear, at my age one is either thinking or sleeping." "Occasionally both." Lucy smiled faintly but remained troubled. "I keep wondering about Mrs. Ashcombe. She cannot have been happy." "Happiness," said Miss Marple, threading another piece of wool through her needles, "is very unevenly distributed among the rich, rather like good handwriting." Lucy laughed softly. Then she grew serious again. "Inspector Hewitt came this morning." "Indeed?" He says Mr. Pike may be formally charged." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "That seems quick. There was apparently another quarrel. Witnesses heard them arguing near the post office 2 days ago." "Yes," murmured Miss Marple. "Villagers hear remarkably well when voices rise outdoors." Lucy leaned forward. "You don't believe he did it?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Outside, rain tapped gently at the windows. "At times," she said at last, "a person may appear guilty because the truth surrounding them is untidy. But murder itself is usually extraordinarily tidy. It requires decision." Lucy frowned slightly. "I'm not sure I understand." "Most people," said Miss Marple, "avoid unpleasantness whenever possible. Murderers do not. They choose unpleasantness very definitely indeed." Before Lucy could reply, the maid entered. "There's a gentleman asking for Miss Marple." "A gentleman?" "Yes, miss." "From London." Lucy raised her eyebrows. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "How interesting." The visitor stood near the umbrella stand in the entrance hall, removing wet gloves with careful precision. He was perhaps 45, tall, dark-haired, and dressed with understated elegance. Rainwater glistened upon the shoulders of his coat. Something about him suggested both confidence and fatigue. He bowed slightly. "Miss Marple, my name is Adrian Vale." The name meant nothing immediately, though Miss Marple noticed Lucy stiffen faintly behind her. "You have business in Willowbrook, Mr. Vale?" "I had business with Mrs. Ashcombe." His voice was low and cultivated. "I arrived this morning from London and learned of her death scarcely an hour ago." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "And yet you came directly here?" A slight smile touched his mouth. "I was told you possess a talent for understanding difficult situations." Lucy looked startled. Miss Marple merely folded her hands. "Who told you that?" "Mr. Leonard Pike." That interested her considerably. She invited him into the drawing-room. Once seated, Adrian Vale accepted tea, but did not drink it. Rain blurred the windows behind him. "I should explain," he said. "Mrs. Ashcombe wrote to me 3 weeks ago requesting a meeting." "For what purpose?" "She claimed to possess information concerning my family." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened quietly. "And did she?" "I don't know. We never met." Lucy spoke at last. "You had never known her before?" "No." "Then why would she contact you?" A faint hesitation appeared. "My late brother was connected with Ashcombe Hall many years ago." Miss Marple noticed the careful wording. "Connected how?" "He worked here briefly after the war." "And afterward?" "He died." There was something restrained in the way he said "Itaz," though grief had long ago hardened into caution. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Did Mrs. Ashcombe explain why she wished to see you now after all these years?" "Only that certain matters had become dangerous." Lucy exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Again that word. Mr. Vale reached into his coat pocket. "She enclosed this." He handed over a folded sheet of paper. It contained only a single sentence written in sharp black ink. "The cupboard must remain closed for everyone's sake." Lucy stared. "That's absurd." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "which is precisely why it matters." "Adrian." Vale watched her carefully. "You know about the cupboard, then?" "A little." "I suspect Mrs. Ashcombe." "You know about the cupboard, then?" "A little." "I suspect Mrs. Ashcombe feared someone." Miss Marple nodded. "So do I." "And someone killed her before she could speak." There was no melodrama in his tone, only certainty. Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully. "You seem remarkably sure of murder, Mr. Vale." He met her gaze calmly. "Because Beatrice Ashcombe was not the sort of woman who surrendered to fear. If she was silenced, someone silenced her deliberately." The room grew very still. Lucy spoke quietly. "You disliked her?" A curious expression crossed Adrian Vale's face. "Miss Dane, one may dislike a person and still prefer them alive." After luncheon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the solicitor's office. Mr. Pike looked exhausted. Files lay open across his desk, though it was obvious he had not truly been reading them. "Miss Marple, you seem troubled. My dear lady, half the village suspects me of murder." "Yes," said Miss Marple sympathetically. "Villages enjoy certainty. It saves thinking." He gave a weary smile despite himself. "You've spoken with Inspector Hewitt?" "Briefly. He believes your quarrel with Mrs. Ashcombe concerned changes to her will." "It did." Mr. Pike removed his spectacles. "She intended to leave Ashcombe Hall to a charitable trust." "And you advised against it?" "I advised caution." His voice tightened. "The woman was becoming irrational." "In what way?" He hesitated. "She believed someone was blackmailing her." Miss Marple sat very still. "Did you?" "At first, no." "And later?" Mr. Pike looked toward the rain-streaked window. Later I wasn't certain. He opened a drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope. She asked me to keep this if anything happened to her. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. You have not shown it to the police? Not yet. That is dangerous. Yes, he said quietly. I know. After a moment he handed it to her. Inside was a photograph, slightly faded. It showed a group of people standing beside a garden wall at Ashcombe Hall many years earlier. A younger Beatrice Ashcombe stood near the center. Beside her was a handsome young man Miss Marple did not recognize, and in the background, partially obscured by shadows, stood another figure. Adrian Vale. Or rather a much younger version of him. Lucy leaned closer. When was this taken? 1947, said Mr. Pike. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly across the image. Then she noticed something else. Near the edge of the photograph, barely visible behind the group, stood the narrow door of the morning-room cupboard. And inside, something was missing from the shelves, something rectangular, about the size of a small locked box. Miss Marple looked up very slowly. Mr. Pike, she said softly, what used to be kept in that cupboard? The solicitor's face lost what little color remained in it. Outside rain hammered suddenly against the windows, and after a long silence Leonard Pike answered. Documents? Then even more quietly. Documents someone would kill to hide. In villages scandal did not arrive dramatically. It seeped, like rain beneath a door or smoke through keyholes. It crept quietly from house to house until every drawing-room carried the faint odor of it. By Thursday morning Willowbrook had begun dividing itself into camps. There were those convinced that Leonard Pike had poisoned Mrs. Ashcombe to conceal financial misconduct. There were others who preferred the more romantic notion of blackmail and hidden wartime secrets. A few maintained stubbornly that the whole affair was foreign in nature, which in English villages generally meant both immoral and vaguely continental. Miss Marple listened to all of it with polite attention. Human beings, she reflected, rarely lied more enthusiastically than when inventing explanations. She was walking slowly along Church Lane when she encountered Reverend Dane emerging from the post office carrying 2 damp parcels and an expression of deep discouragement. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, "I begin to understand why detectives in novels take to drink." "That is because fictional detectives are generally men," said Miss Marple. "Women simply develop headaches." The vicar sighed. "I've just spent 20 minutes listening to Mrs. Finch explain why poison is morally worse than shooting." "And what conclusion did she reach?" "She believes poison indicates disappointment in childhood." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "An interesting theory, though I once knew a curate's wife in Devon who attempted arsenic merely because her husband snored." The vicar nearly dropped his parcels. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Human motives are often disappointingly domestic. They walked together toward the church gates. "You've heard about Mr. Pike?" asked the vicar. "Inspector Hewitt questioned him again last night." "Ah?" "He still denies everything, naturally, but matters look unpleasant." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "Yes, which troubles me." The vicar glanced sideways at her. "You think appearances are misleading?" "My dear Reverend Dane, appearances are nearly always misleading. If they were not, civilization would become impossible." They had reached the lich gate when a motor car approached along the lane. It stopped sharply beside them. Inspector Hewitt stepped out. His face suggested a man whose patience had been repeatedly assaulted since breakfast. "Miss Marple." "Inspector, I've just come from Ashcombe Hall." He hesitated. "There's been another incident." The vicar stiffened. "Good heavens!" "Not another death," Hewitt said quickly. "But someone broke into the morning room last night." Miss Marple became very still. "The cupboard?" "Opened again." "And?" "Nothing appears missing." Hewitt frowned. "Yet the room was thoroughly searched." Miss Marple folded her hands upon the handle of her umbrella. "By whom?" Ashcombe Hall seemed darker than before. Rain clouds still hung low across the countryside, filling the long corridors with a dim grey light. Servants moved nervously in pairs now, whispering whenever footsteps approached. Mrs. Pollard, the housekeeper, met them in the entrance hall with visible agitation. "I heard someone after midnight," she declared. "I said so immediately." Inspector Hewitt nodded with restrained patience. "Yes, Mrs. Pollard. There were footsteps. Did you see anyone?" "No, but someone was there." Miss Marple observed the woman carefully. Fear, genuine fear, had begun replacing theatrical distress. That was significant. The morning room showed clear signs of disturbance. Desk drawers stood open. Books had been removed from shelves. A chair lay overturned near the fireplace. The little cupboard door remained ajar. Miss Marple approached it quietly. Inside, folded linens had been pulled onto the floor. Candle boxes opened. Shelves searched hurriedly. Yet the space itself remained absurdly small. Too small, she thought suddenly, for the importance people attached to it. That idea settled somewhere deep in her mind. Inspector Hewitt gestured toward muddy marks near the French windows. Whoever entered came from the garden. Miss Marple bent slightly. The footprints were partial and blurred from rain. But beside one print she noticed something else, a tiny smear of dark green wax. "Curious," she murmured. "What is?" asked Hewitt. Miss Marple pointed with her umbrella tip. The inspector crouched. "Wax?" He straightened slowly. There were candles in the cupboard. "Indeed." Miss Marple said nothing further, but her eyes drifted thoughtfully toward the mantelpiece. One candle there had burned lower than the others, much lower. Later that afternoon, Lucy Dane arrived breathlessly at the vicarage, carrying fresh gossip and visible excitement. "Miss Marple, Inspector Hewitt's arrested someone?" Miss Marple looked up from sorting buttons. "Mr. Pike?" "No." That surprised her. "Then whom?" Lucy lowered her voice dramatically. "Adrian Valley." Miss Marple's hands became still. "On what grounds?" "He was seen near Ashcombe Hall last night." "By whom?" "The gardener's boy." Lucy sat down quickly. "They found mud on his shoes matching the garden path, and apparently he argued with Mrs. Ashcombe years ago." Miss Marple considered this calmly. "How unfortunate." Lucy stared. "That's all you say?" "My dear, arrests are merely administrative. Human nature is more interesting." Lucy gave an exasperated laugh. "You really are impossible sometimes." Perhaps she was, but Miss Marple had already noticed something deeply wrong. Men who committed murder from passion often behaved recklessly afterward. Men who killed from fear behaved carefully. Yet someone had returned to Ashcombe Hall to search openly, almost desperately, through the morning room. Not careful. There was a difference, and desperation generally belonged to people running out of time. That evening Miss Marple paid a small social call upon Dr. Blackwell. The doctor lived in a handsome red brick house near the edge of the village with his unmarried sister, Harriet, who disliked nearly everyone with admirable consistency. Harriet received Miss Marple frostily before retreating upstairs. Dr. Blackwell, however, seemed relieved by company. "You'll take tea?" he asked. "If convenient. It's all inconvenient lately." He poured tea with slightly unsteady hands. Miss Marple watched him over the rim of her cup. "You were acquainted with Mrs. Ashcombe many years, I believe? You knew her husband also?" "Colonel Ashcombe." "During the war, yes." Miss Marple nodded. "And Adrian Vale's brother?" Something flickered across the doctor's face. "Who mentioned him?" "Mr. Pike." Blackwell moved to the window. Rain slid silently down the glass. "Peter Vale worked briefly at Ashcombe Hall after returning from service." "What sort of work?" "Clerical matters, records, inventories." "And afterward?" "He died in an accident." Miss Marple waited. Doctors, she had often found, disliked silence more than clergymen. "It was ruled accidental," Blackwell added. "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. The doctor turned sharply. "What exactly are you implying?" "Nothing at all. Old women merely collect impressions." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You should leave this alone." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear doctor, if human beings left unpleasant things alone, there would be very little history." For an instant something very like fear crossed Edward Blackwell's face. Not fear of scandal, not fear of police, something older, more personal. Miss Marple saw it and remembered. Years ago in St. Mary Mead there had been a churchwarden who looked precisely that way after a child innocently asked him about a locked attic room. Fear connected to the past always possessed the same expression. Before leaving, Miss Marple paused beside the hallway table. Upon it stood a silver candlestick. Dark green wax had hardened along one edge, exactly the same shade she had seen near the cupboard. She looked up. Dr. Blackwell followed her gaze. For one brief second neither spoke. Then Miss Marple said pleasantly, "What an unusual color!" The doctor answered too quickly, "My sister prefers them." And Miss Marple knew with complete certainty that he had lied. Miss Marple slept poorly that night, not from anxiety. She had long ago discovered that anxiety accomplished remarkably little except indigestion. Rather, her mind had become occupied with patterns of behavior, patterns of concealment, and most particularly the curious matter of the cupboard. At 6:30 in the morning she sat by her bedroom window watching rain drift across the gardens of the vicarage, while the village slowly woke beneath grey skies. People, she reflected, often misunderstood hiding-places. The best hiding-places were never remote or elaborate. Human beings trusted familiarity far too much. They ignored what they saw every day, a cupboard in a morning-room, a thing so ordinary that nobody truly examined it, unless they were frightened. That thought remained with her through breakfast. Lucy arrived late, carrying toast and fresh agitation. "There's more gossip," she announced. "There usually is before marmalade." Lucy ignored this. Inspector Hewitt searched Adrian Vale's hotel room in Medchester. They found burned papers in the grate. Miss Marple buttered toast calmly. "What sort of papers?" "No one knows exactly." "How disappointing." Lucy sat opposite her. "You don't seem surprised." "My dear, when police suspect a person, they become wonderfully efficient at discovering suspicious objects." Lucy hesitated. "There's something else." "Yes? Mr. Pike disappeared last night." Miss Marple looked up sharply for the first time that morning. "Disappeared?" "He never returned home. His clerk says he left the office after dusk and simply vanished." That, Miss Marple thought, was genuinely interesting. Not because disappearance implied guilt, but because guilty men rarely vanished at the correct dramatic moment unless someone intended them to. By 11 o'clock Inspector Hewitt had transformed the drawing-room at Ashcombe Hall into a temporary headquarters. Papers covered every surface. 2 constables moved quietly between rooms. Outside, villagers gathered hopefully near the gates despite the weather. Miss Marple arrived to find the inspector in poor spirits. "Missing now," he muttered, as though matters weren't complicated enough already. "Mr. Pike? Do you believe he fled?" Hewitt hesitated. "I believed it this morning." "And now?" The inspector rubbed tired eyes. "Now I'm less certain." Miss Marple sat down quietly. "Tell me about the burned papers." "Fragments only." Hewitt opened a folder. "Nothing complete." He handed her several blackened scraps. Most were unreadable. One contained only a few surviving words. "Hall inventory " Another. "Cabinet key." Miss Marple became very still. "Inventory," she repeated softly. "The word interests you?" "Very much." Inspector Hewitt watched her with increasing frustration. "You know something. My dear Inspector, I know human beings. It is both simpler and more alarming." She rose and crossed slowly toward the morning-room. The cupboard door remained open now, exposed under full daylight. Miss Marple stood before it for nearly a minute without speaking. Then she asked, "How old is this cabinet?" Hewitt blinked. "The cupboard?" "I've no idea. Original to the house, perhaps." She bent slightly. The paint along the lower hinges appeared newer than elsewhere. "Very slightly newer." "Curious," she murmured again. The inspector folded his arms. "You say that rather often." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "because human wickedness is usually disappointing, but human foolishness continues to surprise me." Before Hewitt could respond, footsteps sounded sharply in the hall. Dr. Blackwell entered. He looked exhausted. "There's been an accident." Every person in the room turned. "What sort of accident?" asked Hewitt quickly. The doctor swallowed. "Leonard Pike's car was found near the old quarry road." Silence followed. "Was he inside?" asked the inspector. Blackwell nodded slowly. "He's dead." The quarry road lay 2 miles beyond Willowbrook, where the countryside became rough and uneven. Miss Marple did not accompany the police immediately. Instead, she remained at Ashcombe Hall, standing quietly beside the morning-room fireplace. Lucy joined her a few minutes later, pale-faced. "Another murder?" "Perhaps. But surely—" "My dear Lucy," said Miss Marple gently, "people frequently kill once from panic. Twice generally means purpose." Lucy shivered. "You think someone's silencing people?" "Yes." Miss Marple's gaze moved again toward the cupboard. "Or protecting something." The younger woman lowered her voice. What could possibly matter this much? Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she walked toward the bookshelf beside the cupboard. There she paused. A faint line of dust outlined a rectangular shape missing from the shelf. Recently removed. She touched the wood lightly. "What is?" "There was a box here." Lucy stared. "How can you tell?" "My dear, dust is remarkably honest." She turned slowly back toward the cupboard itself, and then, all at once, she noticed the true peculiarity. Not the shelves, not the lock. The depth. The cabinet was too shallow. From outside, the wall measurements should have allowed another 6 inches at least. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Inspector," she called softly. Hewitt entered impatiently. "Yes? This cupboard has been altered." "Why?" "The back panel." He frowned. "Nonsense." "Possibly," said Miss Marple, "but I do not think so." The inspector stepped forward and examined the interior more carefully. At first nothing appeared unusual. Then he touched the rear wood paneling. His expression changed. There was a hollow sound, very faint, but unmistakable. Hewitt straightened abruptly. "Good God!" One of the constables fetched tools. Within minutes the thin wooden panel had been pried loose. Behind it lay a narrow hidden compartment, but not long empty. Dust marks showed clearly where something rectangular had rested for years. "Something recently removed," Lucy whispered. So that was it. Miss Marple said nothing. Inside the compartment, however, one small object remained overlooked in the corner. A single brass button, old-fashioned, military. Inspector Hewitt picked it up carefully. The crest upon it was worn but visible. Dr. Blackwell, who had returned silently to the doorway, went completely white. Miss Marple turned and looked at him. The doctor spoke almost inaudibly. "That's impossible." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Is it?" Blackwell stared at the button as though seeing a ghost. It belonged to Peter Vale. And suddenly the room no longer felt merely dangerous. It felt haunted. That evening the rain finally ceased. Mist drifted low across the village fields, while lamps glowed warmly behind cottage curtains. Miss Marple sat alone beside the fire at the vicarage, her knitting untouched. Peter Vale, dead after the war. Ruled accidental. A hidden compartment. Documents missing. And now Leonard Pike dead before he could speak further. The pieces were drawing together at last. Not neatly. Human beings were never neat, but closely enough. Lucy entered quietly, carrying fresh tea. "You've solved something," she said at once. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, one never truly solves murder. One merely untangles vanity, fear, and greed, until the truth grows embarrassed and appears." Lucy sat down. "Who is it?" Miss Marple reached slowly for her teacup. Then she said, "I believe someone in Willowbrook has spent nearly 20 years protecting a lie." Outside, beyond the darkened windows, a figure stood motionless beneath the yew trees, watching the vicarage, watching Miss Marple, and after several long moments the figure quietly disappeared into the mist. The news of Leonard Pike's death spread through Willowbrook before breakfast the next morning. By 9 o'clock the village had become subdued in the peculiar manner of English communities confronted with repeated tragedy. Voices lowered instinctively, doors opened more slowly, and even gossip acquired an air of moral exhaustion. Yet beneath the restraint excitement burned fiercer than ever. 2 deaths might be misfortune. 3 suggested drama. Miss Marple sat near the drawing-room window at the vicarage with a basket of mending untouched beside her. Her attention rested not upon the sewing but upon the lane outside, where villagers passed in cautious clusters under a pale recovering sky. Lucy entered, carrying the morning paper. "They're calling it an accident publicly," she said. "Mr. Pike's death?" "Yes. His motor car apparently went through the quarry barrier." Miss Marple nodded. "And privately?" Lucy folded the newspaper. "Privately everyone thinks he was murdered." "My dear," said Miss Marple, "everyone in villages always thinks murder more probable than accidents. It gives a pleasant sense of importance." Lucy sat down heavily. "You really can be dreadful." "Only accurate." The younger woman hesitated. "Inspector Hewitt is coming this morning." He sounded upset. Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. "Poor man." Policemen dislike mysteries that become complicated. It interferes with paperwork. Inspector Hewitt arrived precisely at 10. He looked tired, damp, and profoundly irritated. By human behavior. "I suppose," he announced while removing gloves, "you already know half the village believes there's a wartime conspiracy." "Only half?" asked Miss Marple mildly. He gave her a look. The Quarry Road barrier was tampered with. Lucy gasped softly. "So it wasn't an accident?" "No." Hewitt sat heavily. Pike's steering failed on the bend. Someone loosened the mechanism deliberately. Miss Marple folded her hands. "And when did this someone have opportunity?" "The car stood outside Pike's office most of yesterday evening. Accessible to anyone." "Precisely." The inspector leaned forward. "There's more. We searched Pike's office thoroughly after the crash. He'd been investigating something himself." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "How do you know?" "Notes." Hewitt opened a small notebook. References to military records, property inventories, old correspondence from Ashcombe Hall. Lucy frowned. What does military history have to do with Mrs. Ashcombe? That, said Hewitt grimly, is becoming the central question. Miss Marple rose quietly. And Adrienne Valle? Still under suspicion. The inspector hesitated, though less comfortably than before. Why? Because Pike telephoned him yesterday afternoon. Miss Marple paused. Indeed? Yeah. Hotel staff confirmed it. And what was discussed? We don't know. But they met? Hewitt nodded reluctantly. At the Quarry Road Inn. Lucy stared. Before the crash. Miss Marple moved slowly toward the fireplace. There it was again. Not coincidence. Convergence. People circling the same buried thing. You've spoken with Dr. Blackwell? She asked suddenly. The inspector looked surprised. Yeah. Why? What did he say regarding Peter Vale? Hewitt frowned. Very little. Only that the man died in a climbing accident shortly after the war. Miss Marple's gaze rested thoughtfully upon the fire. And did you believe him? The inspector hesitated too long. That afternoon Miss Marple decided upon a small experiment. She visited the churchyard. Not because she possessed any sentimental attachment to graves. She did not, but because churchyards preserved facts with admirable stubbornness. The old stones behind St. Jude's leaned crookedly among damp grass and yew shadows. Rainwater glittered in worn inscriptions. Miss Marple walked slowly between them until she found what she sought. Peter Vale. O 1921 o 1947. Faithful unto death. She stood silently for a moment. Then she noticed something curious. Fresh flowers, not expensive flowers, simply wild foxgloves and white daisies tied carefully with string. Recently placed. Interesting, she murmured. You think so too? Miss Marple turned. Vale stood a few yards away beneath the yews. He looked older today, more tired. You visit often? She asked. Whenever I can. His eyes rested on the grave. Peter liked this village once. Miss Marple regarded him quietly. And afterward? A faint, bitter smile crossed his face. Afterward he wanted to leave it forever. The wind stirred softly through the trees. You believe his death was not accidental, said Miss Marple. It was not a question. Vale looked at her steadily. No. Why? Because my brother wrote to me 3 days before he died. He said he'd discovered something at Ashcombe Hall. Miss Marple waited. He sounded frightened, Vale said quietly, but also excited, as though he intended to expose someone. What someone? I never knew. Miss Marple studied him carefully. You suspected Mrs. Ashcombe? At first. And now? Vale looked toward the distant village. Now I think she was frightened too. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes. They stood in silence a while. Then Adrian Vale said, Inspector Hewitt believes I returned to Ashcombe Hall to retrieve the hidden documents. Did you? No. Miss Marple believed him, not because he seemed sincere. Sincerity was notoriously unreliable, but because fear and grief sat differently upon innocent people than guilty ones. Vale carried old grief, not immediate guilt. Someone else removed them first, he said, and killed Pike before he could find them. Vale looked at her sharply. You know who it is? Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear Mr. Vale, knowing and proving are such inconveniently separate things. That evening a storm rolled once more across Willowbrook. The vicarage windows rattled softly under rising wind, while thunder muttered over distant hills. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room with Lucy and Reverend Dane when the telephone rang. The vicar answered, then slowly turned pale. What is it? Asked Lucy. He lowered the receiver carefully. That was Inspector Hewitt. A pause. There's been another attack. Mrs. Pollard, the housekeeper, had been found unconscious at Ashcombe Hall. Miss Marple arrived shortly after the doctor. The atmosphere inside the house had become unbearable now. Fear lingered in every corridor. Dr. Blackwell emerged from upstairs looking grave. She'll live, he said. A blow to the head. Inspector Hewitt stood beside the staircase, furious. She was searching the attic when someone struck her. Miss Marple became alert immediately. The attic? Why? Hewitt exhaled sharply. She apparently believed Mrs. Ashcombe hid papers somewhere upstairs. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. So now everyone searches. Apparently. A constable approached carrying a small object wrapped in cloth. Found beside the attic stairs, sir. Inspector Hewitt unfolded it carefully. A key. Old brass. Miss Marple stepped closer. Not merely any key. a cabinet key, very small, and hanging from it by faded thread was a paper label. "Morning room inner lock." The room grew still, Lucy whispered. There was another compartment? Miss Marple took the key gently. Number. Not another compartment, another lock, which meant the hidden space behind the cupboard had once contained something secured separately. Something important enough to require concealment inside concealment. Inspector Hewitt looked grim. "We searched the compartment thoroughly. There's no box there now." "No," said Miss Marple softly, "but someone removed it recently." Her fingers closed lightly around the tiny brass key, and at last, deep within her mind, the final shape of the mystery began slowly to emerge. Not completely, but enough. Enough to understand why people were dying. Enough to know that the truth had begun long before Mrs. Ashcombe drank poisoned tea. It had begun nearly 20 years earlier, with something hidden, something stolen, and someone who had never stopped being afraid. The storm passed during the night, leaving Willowbrook washed clean beneath a pale and fragile sunlight. For the first time in days the village appeared almost peaceful again. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. Shopkeepers swept rainwater from doorsteps. Somewhere beyond the green a lawn-mower buzzed with determined optimism. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms of morning there remained an unmistakable tension. People had begun locking doors. That, Miss Marple thought, was always the true sign that fear had settled into a village, not gossip, not suspicion. She was arranging roses in a small glass bowl when Lucy entered the drawing-room carrying a letter. "For you." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. No stamp. It was delivered by hand. How mysterious. Lucy watched as she unfolded the paper. The message was brief. "You are asking dangerous questions. Leave the past buried." No signature. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear," said Lucy anxiously, "that's not amusing. On the contrary, anonymous warnings are invariably encouraging. They suggest one is approaching accuracy." Lucy sat down abruptly. "You really are the least alarmable person I've ever known." Miss Marple considered this. "No, I alarm quite easily. I simply dislike giving murderers the satisfaction of noticing." Shortly before noon she walked to Ashcombe Hall. Inspector Hewitt had ordered another complete search of the house. Constables moved methodically through rooms, opening drawers, examining trunks, and irritating servants. The inspector himself stood in the library studying old household records with visible resentment. "I've spent 6 hours reading inventories of curtains," he announced as Miss Marple entered. "If I survive this case, I shall never look at upholstery again." Miss Marple sat quietly. "Have you found anything useful?" "Possibly." He handed her a yellowed ledger. "Hall inventory records from 1946. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Page after page listed furniture, silverware, paintings, and wartime storage items. Then one entry caught her eye. One locked dispatch box transferred to morning-room cabinet by instruction of Colonel Ashcombe. Below it, in different handwriting, "Removed July 1947. Miss Marple looked up slowly. "Who wrote the second notation?" "We think Peter Vale." Inspector Hewitt leaned against the desk. "There's more. Colonel Ashcombe served in military intelligence during the war." Miss Marple was not surprised. Certain kinds of secrecy lingered around people permanently, like cigar smoke. "And after the war?" "He died suddenly in 1946. Heart failure?" "Convenient timing," murmured Miss Marple. The inspector looked sharply at her. "You suspect something there, too?" "My dear Inspector, whenever people begin hiding documents, one must naturally become interested in the people who possessed them first." Before Hewitt could answer, footsteps approached rapidly in the corridor. Dr. Blackwell entered. He looked strained. "There's someone here asking questions," he said sharply. "A journalist from London." Hewitt swore softly under his breath. "Wonderful. He's already speaking to villagers." Miss Marple observed the doctor carefully. "You seem unusually troubled by journalists." Blackwell's expression hardened. "This village has suffered enough." "Indeed," said Miss Marple gently, "though truth generally suffers longer than villages." For an instant the doctor looked almost angry. Then he controlled himself. "I came because Mrs. Pollard wishes to speak." The housekeeper lay upstairs in a small bedroom overlooking the gardens. She appeared frightened rather than injured. "I remembered something," she whispered once the others gathered around her bed. Inspector Hewitt stepped forward immediately. "Yes?" Mrs. Pollard twisted nervously beneath the blankets. "It was years ago, just after Colonel Ashcombe died." Miss Marple sat beside her quietly. "Take your time." The woman swallowed. "I heard Mrs. Ashcombe arguing with Peter Vale." The room became still. "What about?" asked Hewitt. "He wanted something returned." "The box?" said Miss Marple softly. Mrs. Pollard nodded weakly. "He said it didn't belong to her husband." "And what did Mrs. Ashcombe say?" The housekeeper closed her eyes briefly. "She said some things were too dangerous to give back." Silence followed. Outside, crows called across the wet gardens. Inspector Hewitt spoke carefully. "Did Peter Vale threaten her?" "No." "Did Peter Vale threaten her?" "No." Mrs. Pollard's voice trembled. He sounded frightened, not angry. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. Frightened again. Always fear. Never greed. That mattered. "Then what happened?" asked Lucy quietly. Mrs. Pollard looked toward the window. "A week later he died. That afternoon Miss Marple requested a rather unusual favor. She asked Reverend Dane to accompany her to the attic. The vicar looked bewildered but complied politely. The attic of Ashcombe Hall stretched beneath sloping beams crowded with trunks, old furniture, and decades of forgotten possessions. Dust floated thickly in narrow shafts of sunlight. Miss Marple moved slowly among the boxes. "You are searching for hidden papers?" asked the vicar. "No." "Then what?" He blinked. "My dear Reverend Dane, houses resemble people far more than architects admit." She stopped beside a row of old storage chests. One bore military markings faded nearly invisible with age. Miss Marple brushed dust from the lid. Then she froze. There, scratched into the wood with something sharp, were initials. P.V.A.V. Peter Vale. The vicar leaned closer. "Good heavens!" Miss Marple opened the chest carefully. Inside lay blankets, old ration books, and yellowed newspapers. Nothing remarkable. Yet as she lifted the newspapers, something slipped free and fluttered to the floor. A photograph. Miss Marple picked it up slowly. It showed several men in military uniform standing beside a transport truck during the war. One was Colonel Ashcombe. Another was a younger Dr. Blackwell. And beside them, Peter Vale. But it was not the men themselves that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the crate visible behind them, stamped clearly upon the side. Property Recovery Unit. The vicar frowned. "What does that mean?" Miss Marple's face had grown very thoughtful indeed. During wartime, valuable objects disappeared constantly. Paintings. And afterward, many things were never properly returned. Suddenly the hidden box made terrible sense. Not blackmail, not romance, something older. Something criminal concealed beneath respectability. The vicar stared at her. "You've understood something." "Yes, and it's serious." Miss Marple folded the photograph carefully. "My dear Reverend Dane," she said softly, "I believe people have been dying to protect theft disguised as patriotism." That evening Inspector Hewitt arrived at the vicarage visibly shaken. "They found blood in the library at Ashcombe Hall," he announced. Lucy gasped. "Whose blood?" "We don't know yet." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "And where exactly?" "Near the fireplace." A curious expression crossed her face. "The fireplace," she repeated. The inspector frowned. "What is it?" Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. "My dear Inspector, I think our murderer has become desperate." "Why?" "Because desperate people begin searching in the wrong places." She moved toward the window thoughtfully. The hidden compartment behind the cupboard was only part of the concealment. Hewitt stared. "You mean there's another hiding place?" Miss Marple looked out into the darkening garden. "Yes," she said quietly, "and I believe someone has just realized it." Chapter 8, The Firelight Confession. That evening a dense mist crept over Willowbrook from the low marsh fields beyond the river. By 8 o'clock the village seemed suspended in whiteness. Lamps glowed dimly behind curtained windows, and figures passing along the lanes appeared only briefly before dissolving again into shadow. Miss Marple disliked fog. Not because it frightened her, but because it encouraged foolishness in others. Human beings became strangely theatrical in mist. Inspector Hewitt remained at the vicarage longer than intended, pacing slowly before the fire, while Lucy poured coffee no one truly wanted. "You believe there's another hiding place in Ashcombe Hall," he said. "And the murderer knows this too?" "I think so." The inspector frowned. "But if the documents were already removed from the cupboard compartment—" "Then someone removed the wrong thing," said Miss Marple quietly. Silence followed. Lucy stared at her. "There were two objects?" "Possibly." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Or perhaps one object and one misunderstanding." Hewitt stopped pacing. "You're being obscure again." "My dear Inspector, murderers themselves are obscure. One merely adapts." The vicar entered then, carrying fresh coal for the fire. "The fog's thickening badly," he remarked. One can scarcely see the church gates. Miss Marple looked toward the darkened window thoughtfully. "Fog is very useful," she murmured. "For what?" asked Lucy. "For moving unseen." At that exact moment the telephone rang. The sound startled all of them. Reverend Dane answered, then turned sharply. "It's Mrs. Pollard." Something in his face made Miss Marple rise immediately. "She says someone's inside the hall." Ashcombe Hall loomed out of the fog like a shipwreck. The police motor car halted sharply upon the gravel drive. Light blazed from several downstairs windows, though much of the house remained swallowed by mist. "Mrs. Pollard met them in the entrance hall, trembling violently. "I heard movement in the library," she whispered. Then footsteps. Inspector Hewitt motioned to the constables. "Search the ground floor." The men disappeared silently into the corridors. Miss Marple remained very still, listening. There it was, a faint sound somewhere deeper in the house. Not movement, metal. Very soft. "Library," she said quietly. Hewitt looked at her sharply and hurried toward the room. The library door stood half open. Inside, firelight flickered across shelves and dark furniture. Papers lay scattered upon the carpet near the desk, and kneeling beside the fireplace was Dr. Blackwell. For one frozen instant nobody moved. The doctor rose slowly. In his hand he held a blackened iron box, small enough to fit beneath one arm. Inspector Hewitt stepped forward instantly. "What is that?" Blackwell's face had gone utterly gray. No one was supposed to find it. The silence in the room deepened. Miss Marple looked toward the fireplace. One of the stone panels beside the hearth had been shifted aside, a hidden recess. Not the cupboard itself. The cupboard had concealed the existence of hidden storage in the room, but the true hiding place had always been elsewhere. How very like human nature, thought Miss Marple. People stared at the obvious secret and overlooked the real one beside it. Hewitt's voice hardened. "Open the box." Blackwell hesitated, then slowly handed it over. Inside lay bundles of papers tied carefully with faded ribbon. Military records, correspondence, inventory lists, and beneath them, jewelry. Gold pieces glittered dimly in the firelight. Lucy gasped softly. Inspector Hewitt stared. "What in God's name?" Miss Marple spoke quietly. "Looted property." No one answered. Blackwell sank heavily into a chair. "It wasn't meant to happen that way." Miss Marple regarded him sadly. "No," she agreed. "These things rarely are." For several moments only the fire crackled softly. Then Inspector Hewitt said, "You'd better explain everything." Dr. Blackwell covered his face briefly with one hand. "When the war ended," he said hoarsely, "Colonel Ashcombe supervised recovery shipments in Europe. Valuable property recovered from abandoned estates and military depots." "The Property Recovery Unit," said Miss Marple softly. Blackwell nodded. "There was confusion everywhere. Records incomplete. Items disappearing constantly." He swallowed. "Ashcombe realized certain valuables could vanish permanently if paperwork disappeared with them." "The dispatch box," said Hewitt. Blackwell stared into the fire. At first it was temporary, or so he claimed. Jewelry, documents, valuables waiting to be sorted properly. Miss Marple said gently, "But they were never returned." "No." His voice cracked slightly. "Peter Vale discovered it accidentally while working on inventories after the war." "And threatened exposure," said the inspector. "He wanted everything reported immediately." Blackwell closed his eyes. "Ashcombe panicked," Lucy whispered. "Did Colonel Ashcombe kill him?" The doctor looked up sharply. "No." Then, after a terrible pause, "But he confronted Peter the night before the accident." Silence followed. "And afterward?" asked Miss Marple. "Colonel Ashcombe died a few months later. Heart failure." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "And Mrs. Ashcombe inherited the secret." Blackwell nodded slowly. "She hated it, feared it, but she also feared scandal." Inspector Hewitt held up the papers. "So someone began blackmailing her." Blackwell hesitated. Then quietly, "Leonard Peake." Lucy stared in shock. "But he was trying to investigate." "He changed his mind later," said Miss Marple softly. Everyone turned toward her. She continued calmly, "Mr. Pike discovered the truth years ago through legal records. At first he protected Mrs. Ashcombe. Then financial difficulties tempted him." Hewitt frowned. "But if Pike was blackmailing her, why was he killed?" Miss Marple looked toward Dr. Blackwell. "Because she already knew. And so, apparently, did he." The doctor's shoulders sagged. He was going to confess everything. Inspector Hewitt became very still. "You killed Pike." Blackwell spoke almost inaudibly. Lucy gave a faint cry. The doctor stared helplessly at the floor. He telephoned me after meeting Adrian Vale. Said he couldn't continue. Said he'd go to police. His voice trembled. He wanted to expose everything. So you sabotaged his car. Blackwell nodded once. And Mrs. Ashcombe? Asked Hewitt sharply. The doctor closed his eyes. No. The room fell silent again. Inspector Hewitt stared hard at him. You expect me to believe that? Blackwell looked desperately toward Miss Marple. I argued with her that afternoon, yes, but I didn't poison her. Miss Marple said quietly, I do not think he did. Everyone turned toward her. Hewitt looked incredulous. Good Lord, Miss Marple. The doctor killed Pike from panic, she said gently. But Mrs. Ashcombe's death required something colder. She moved slowly toward the tea-tray still standing near the library sofa from earlier police examinations. One murder concealed a secret, she continued. The second silenced exposure. Different motives entirely. The inspector stared. You mean there are two murderers? Miss Marple's eyes rested on the firelight. No, she said softly. I mean the first murder has not yet been understood properly at all. And in that instant, somewhere deep within the house, a floorboard creaked. Every head in the library lifted. The creak had come distinctly from above. Inspector Hewitt reacted instantly. Who's there? No answer. Only the low hiss of the fire and the distant murmur of fog against the windows. Then came another sound. A footstep, very slight, but unmistakable. One of the constables moved toward the door. Upstairs, sir. Hewitt nodded sharply. Come on. The men hurried into the hall. Lucy instinctively moved closer to Miss Marple. Dr. Blackwell remained seated like a man emptied of strength. Miss Marple alone did not appear surprised, because, she reflected, guilty people often lingered near revelations. Human beings possessed a dreadful fascination with their own exposure. From the staircase came sudden movement, a cry, then rapid footsteps descending. Inspector Hewitt's voice rang out sharply. Stop! A figure emerged through the foggy shadows of the upper landing and ran toward the rear corridor. Miss Marple saw only fragments at first. Dark clothing. A woman. Quick, desperate motion. Then the figure vanished toward the servants' staircase. Constables thundered after her, Lucy whispered. Who was it? Miss Marple's eyes had narrowed thoughtfully. Someone very frightened. Moments later came confusion from the back hall. Doors opening, men shouting, then silence. Inspector Hewitt returned looking furious. She escaped through the garden. Did you see her clearly? Asked Miss Marple. Not well enough. He paused. Though Mrs. Pollard thinks it was Harriet Blackwell. Dr. Blackwell looked up sharply. My sister? The inspector's expression hardened. She's disappeared. Harriet Blackwell's house stood dark and empty when police arrived shortly afterward. A lamp still burned in the sitting room. Half-finished tea remained beside the hearth. But Harriet herself had vanished. Miss Marple stood quietly near the window while Inspector Hewitt searched drawers with mounting irritation. This is absurd, he muttered. Why run unless she's involved? Miss Marple glanced around the neat little room. Unlike her brother's house, Harriet's possessions displayed precision bordering upon severity. Books aligned exactly, cushions undisturbed. Even the ornaments upon the mantel seemed arranged according to moral principle. Harriet Blackwell, Miss Marple thought, was not a naturally impulsive woman, which meant fear must have driven her very hard indeed. Her gaze drifted toward a small writing desk. There, beside an inkstand, stood a framed photograph, a younger Harriet beside Dr. Blackwell, and between them, Mrs. Ashcombe, all three smiling. Miss Marple looked more closely. The photograph had been folded once long ago, leaving a faint crease directly through Beatrice Ashcombe's face. Inspector, she said quietly, how long had Harriet Blackwell known Mrs. Ashcombe? Most of her life, I suppose. Yes, but not merely socially. Hewitt frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple touched the photograph lightly. Women do not crease photographs accidentally. The inspector looked unconvinced. My dear man, said Miss Marple patiently, female dislike leaves traces everywhere. At that moment a constable entered carrying a small leather notebook. Found upstairs, sir? Hewitt opened it quickly. Inside were pages of tightly written household accounts. Nothing unusual at first glance. Then, halfway through, several entries appeared repeatedly. B.A. payment received. L.P. discussion postponed. D.B. warned again. Inspector Hewitt stared. Blackmail payments. Miss Marple shook her head softly. No. He looked up. No? These are reminders, not transactions. Lucy frowned. Reminders of what? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. because suddenly another piece had fallen into place. Not greed, not simple concealment, something more personal, something rooted in resentment. She turned slowly toward Dr. Blackwell, who stood pale and shaken near the doorway. "Your sister hated Mrs. Ashcombe," she said gently. The doctor closed his eyes. Inspector Hewitt looked sharply between them. "Why?" For several moments Blackwell said nothing. Then, at last, "Because Beatrice ruined someone Harriet loved." The story emerged slowly, painfully, in fragments. Years earlier, before the war, Harriet Blackwell had been engaged to Peter Vale. Miss Marple listened silently while the doctor spoke. "They intended to marry after his military service," he said quietly. "Then he came to Ashcombe Hall after the war and discovered the hidden property." "Mrs. Ashcombe knew?" asked Lucy. "And Colonel Ashcombe?" Terrified, Dr. Blackwell stared blankly at the floor. "Peter wanted everything reported. He said stolen property belonged to surviving families." His voice trembled faintly. "But Beatrice feared scandal would destroy them all." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The doctor continued. "There was an argument the night before Peter died. Harriet overheard part of it." Inspector Hewitt folded his arms. "And afterward she blamed Mrs. Ashcombe." A terrible silence followed. Lucy whispered. "She thought Mrs. Ashcombe caused Peter's death." Dr. Blackwell nodded. "For 20 years." Miss Marple moved quietly toward the fireplace. There it was, at last, the true emotional center of the crime. Not money, not jewels. Old grief, old grievance preserved carefully until it hardened into hatred. Human beings, she reflected sadly, could survive almost anything except prolonged bitterness. Inspector Hewitt spoke Inspector Hewitt spoke sharply. "You think Harriet poisoned Mrs. Ashcombe?" Blackwell looked shattered. "I don't know." But Miss Marple already did. Not with certainty yet, but nearly. It was close to midnight when Miss Marple finally returned to the vicarage. Fog still drifted heavily through Willowbrook, muting every sound. The village seemed suspended outside ordinary time. Lucy lit another lamp while Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly. "You know who killed Mrs. Ashcombe," Lucy said quietly. Miss Marple sat down beside the fire. "And Harriet Blackwell killed her?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she stared thoughtfully into the flames. "My dear," she said at last, "murder is rarely committed at the height of emotion. That is something novels misunderstand dreadfully." Lucy frowned. "But Harriet hated her for years." "Yes, which is precisely why I doubt sudden violence." She folded her hands. "Hatred preserved for decades becomes controlled, cold, careful." Lucy stared. "Then she did do it." Miss Marple's eyes lifted slowly. "I believe Harriet Blackwell intended Mrs. Ashcombe to suffer fear. A pause. But I do not think she intended murder." Lucy went pale. "You mean someone else used her hatred?" Outside, the fog pressed softly against the windows. Miss Marple leaned back quietly. "At last," she murmured, "we arrive at the truly dangerous person." Before Lucy could ask another question, hurried footsteps sounded outside the vicarage. Then someone knocked violently at the front door. Reverend Dane opened it. Vale stood there breathless and pale. "They've found Harriet Blackwell," he said. A terrible pause followed. "Where?" asked Lucy softly. Vale looked toward Miss Marple. "In the churchyard." His voice lowered. "She's dead." The churchyard of St. Jude's looked ghostly beneath the lingering fog. Lantern light moved uncertainly among the gravestones as Inspector Hewitt and the constables crossed the wet grass. The great yew trees loomed black against the whitening sky, their branches dripping silently after the rain. Harriet Blackwell lay near Peter Vale's grave. For one dreadful moment she appeared merely asleep, one hand resting upon the damp earth beside the headstone. But death had already settled unmistakably upon her face. Lucy turned away with a faint gasp. Miss Marple stood very still. "Poor woman," she said softly. Inspector Hewitt crouched beside the body. No visible injuries. Dr. Blackwell, who had arrived moments earlier, sank heavily against the church wall as though his legs had failed him entirely. "My God!" The doctor's voice broke. Miss Marple watched him carefully. This grief, she thought, was genuine, not fearful, not guilty, simply broken. A constable handed Hewitt a small bottle found near Harriet's hand. The inspector uncorked it cautiously and swore under his breath. Lucy stared in horror. "The same poison?" "Looks like it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Harriet Blackwell, dead beside Peter Vale's grave, with poison placed conveniently nearby. Too neat, far too neat. The inspector rose slowly. "Suicide," he said grimly, "or intended to look like it." Miss Marple said nothing, because already another detail troubled her. Harriet's gloves. One remained upon her right hand, the other was missing. Such tiny inconsistencies mattered enormously. Human beings dying by suicide tended to complete small actions automatically. They removed both gloves or neither. Only interruption created imbalance. Miss Marple turned slowly toward the yews. Dark shadows pooled beneath the branches, and suddenly she felt not fear exactly, but certainty. The killer had stood here recently, watching, perhaps even after Harriet died. By dawn the fog had begun to thin. Willowbrook woke to bells, whispers, and spreading shock. A fourth death transformed scandal into terror. At the vicarage breakfast passed almost untouched. Lucy sat pale and exhausted, while Reverend Dane attempted unsuccessfully to read Scripture with composure. Inspector Hewitt arrived shortly after 8. "We found footprints near the north gate," he announced immediately. "Matching anyone?" asked Lucy. "Not clearly. Rain spoiled most of them." Miss Marple poured tea quietly. "And Harriet?" Hewitt exhaled heavily. "Doctor confirms cyanide." "But not self-administered," said Miss Marple. The inspector looked at her sharply. "You're certain?" "Why?" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Because Harriet Blackwell was an orderly woman." Hewitt blinked. "That's your reasoning?" "My dear inspector, personality is always reasoning," she continued gently. "A disordered suicide scene often means interference. Harriet wore one glove. Her handbag remained clasped shut, and she carried no handkerchief despite the weather." Lucy frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," said Miss Marple softly, "someone arranged the scene after death." The inspector sat down slowly. "You think she met someone there?" "Yeah." "And trusted them enough to come alone?" "Precisely." Hewitt rubbed his forehead. "Good Lord." Miss Marple looked toward the window. "Harriet Blackwell knew who poisoned Mrs. Ashcombe." Silence followed. "Not because she witnessed it," Miss Marple continued, "but because she understood afterward that her own bitterness had been used by someone else," Lucy whispered. "So the murderer silenced her." Inspector Hewitt leaned forward. "Then who?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead she asked quietly, "Tell me, Inspector, where exactly was Mrs. Ashcombe's teacup found?" "In the morning room." "Near whom?" He frowned. "No one. She was alone." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No one drinks afternoon tea entirely alone in villages." The inspector stared, and then slowly, very slowly, understanding began creeping across his face. At 11 o'clock Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Elsie Turner. The maid arrived nervously at the vicarage, twisting her gloves. "You wish to see me, miss?" "Yes, my dear." "Sit down." Elsie perched anxiously upon the edge of a chair. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You were very fond of Mrs. Ashcombe, weren't you?" The girl looked startled. "I served her 5 years." "That was not what I asked." Elsie lowered her eyes. She could be difficult. Miss Marple waited patiently. At last the girl whispered. "She was kinder lately." "After becoming frightened?" A small nod. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Tell me about tea that afternoon." Elsie looked up sharply. "The afternoon she died. I brought the tray at 4 o'clock. Who prepared it?" "I did." "And afterward?" Elsie hesitated. "I left it in the pantry briefly." "How briefly?" "Only a minute or two." Miss Marple nodded softly. "Enough time." "Always enough time." "Who passed through the pantry?" The girl's face went pale. "I don't know exactly, but you suspect someone." Tears suddenly filled Elsie's eyes. "Please don't make me say it." Miss Marple's voice remained very gentle. "My dear child, truth does not become kinder merely by waiting." Elsie clasped trembling hands together. "Mrs. Blackwell was there." Miss Marple remained silent. "She'd come to see Mrs. Ashcombe." Elsie swallowed hard. "They argued often lately. And after the tea, I heard shouting in the morning room." The girl's voice shook. "Mrs. Blackwell said, 'You've ruined enough lives already.'" Lucy, standing nearby, drew breath sharply. "Then Harriet did poison her." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. Both turned toward her. The old lady's eyes had become very thoughtful indeed. "My dear Lucy, people who intend murder rarely announce moral accusations first. They avoid memorable scenes whenever possible." She looked back at Elsie. "What happened after the argument?" "Mrs. Blackwell left by the garden doors." "And Mrs. Ashcombe?" "She seemed upset, but alive." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Alive after Harriet departed, which meant the poison entered later." or had already been waiting. Inspector Hewitt arrived just as the realization settled fully into place. Miss Marple looked up at him calmly. "I know who killed Beatrice Ashcombe." The inspector went completely still. "And Harriet Blackwell?" "Then, for heaven's sake—" But Miss Marple raised one hand gently. "Not yet. Not yet? My dear Inspector, frightened murderers are dangerous, particularly intelligent ones." She rose slowly from her chair. "We must give our killer an opportunity to make one final mistake." Outside the window, sunlight finally broke through the clouds over Willowbrook. And for the first time since the fete began, Miss Marple smiled without warmth, because at last she intended to set a trap. The sunshine that followed the long days of rain altered Willowbrook strangely. The village green glowed fresh and deceptively innocent beneath the afternoon light. Children resumed games beside the hedges. Shop doors stood open again. Somewhere from an upstairs window came the cheerful sound of piano scales imperfectly practiced. And yet fear lingered beneath everything. People spoke more quietly now. They glanced behind them while walking home after dusk. Most telling of all, they had stopped speculating openly about the murders. That, Miss Marple thought, was when danger became most serious, for gossip flourished in safety. Silence belonged to fear. She spent much of the afternoon in the vicarage garden, apparently occupied with dead-heading roses, while Lucy hovered nearby in growing impatience. "You're hiding something," Lucy declared at last. Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "My dear, old women always hide things. Usually biscuits. You know exactly who the murderer is. And you still haven't told Inspector Hewitt." "Not completely." Lucy dropped her gardening gloves onto the bench. "How can you remain so calm?" Miss Marple snipped another faded bloom carefully. "Because excitement encourages mistakes. That's absurd." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "It is merely disappointing." She looked up thoughtfully. "Human beings imagine murder springs from passion. Most often it springs from calculation interrupted by panic." Lucy folded her arms. "And what exactly does that mean in this case?" Miss Marple laid aside her shears. It means the murderer never intended 4 deaths." Silence followed. "4?" Lucy whispered.
"Yes."
She counted quietly upon gloved fingers. "Peter Vale first, many years ago. Then Mrs. Ashcombe. Then Leonard Pike. Finally Harriet Blackwell." Lucy stared. "You believe Peter Vale was murdered?"
"Oh, yeah."
The certainty in Miss Marple's voice sent a chill through the warm afternoon air. Lucy sat slowly upon the bench. "But Colonel Ashcombe confronted him before the accident." "Indeed. Then why not Colonel Ashcombe?" Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Because Colonel Ashcombe lacked the necessary temperament." Lucy frowned. "What temperament?" "The patience to kill quietly." Before she could ask more, the gate clicked open. Inspector Hewitt entered, carrying visible frustration. "You wished to see me?" "Yes, Inspector." Miss Marple motioned toward the garden chairs. "No, thank you. I'd prefer murder." "That can generally be arranged in villages," she replied mildly. He sat down heavily. "Well?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I should like you to announce publicly that the hidden dispatch box has been recovered completely intact." Hewitt blinked. "But it hasn't." "Precisely." The inspector stared. "You want me to lie?" "My dear man, policemen do so constantly for admirable reasons." Lucy suppressed a smile. Hewitt rubbed tired eyes. What would this accomplish? Miss Marple's voice softened. "The murderer believes one document is still missing." Then the inspector said slowly, "The real incriminating paper." "Yes, and you think they'll come looking for it?" "I am certain." The inspector leaned forward sharply. "Where?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the distant line of trees beyond the village. "In the one place they now fear it remains." That evening word spread swiftly through Willowbrook. The police, villagers learned, had recovered all missing wartime records from Ashcombe Hall. Moreover, Inspector Hewitt privately hinted to several carefully chosen gossips that one final paper conclusively identified those responsible for Peter Vale's death. By sunset the entire village knew. Miss Marple retired early, or appeared to. In reality, she sat quietly beside the darkened drawing-room window at the vicarage, knitting untouched upon her lap, while Lucy paced restlessly behind her. "This feels dangerous," Lucy whispered. "You think the murderer will move tonight?" "Yes." "How can you possibly know?" Miss Marple looked toward the moonlit garden. Because frightened people cannot sleep while evidence exists. Outside, the village lay hushed beneath silver light and drifting mist. At 10:30, a motor car moved slowly along Church Lane without lamps. Miss Marple noticed it immediately. "So," she murmured softly. Lucy hurried to the window. "Who is it?" "Patience, my dear." The car disappeared toward Ashcombe Hall. 5 minutes later, another figure passed silently along the hedge path on foot. This one moved cautiously, as though familiar with secrecy. Miss Marple rose. "It is time." Ashcombe Hall stood dark except for a single lamp glowing faintly in the library. Inspector Hewitt and 2 constables waited concealed among the shrubs near the terrace. Miss Marple sat beside the inspector with astonishing composure.
"I dislike this," Hewitt muttered.
"So do murderers." Very comforting. From somewhere inside the hall came the muffled sound of a closing door. Then footsteps. A shadow crossed the library curtains. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. The hidden fireplace recess. Of course. That was where the killer would search first. Minutes passed. Then suddenly another figure appeared at the terrace doors. Not entering. Watching. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. 2 people. The watcher moved nervously near the windows while the person inside continued searching. And then, abruptly, the library lamp went out. A cry rang sharply through the darkness. Inspector Hewitt sprang up. "Now!" Constables rushed the terrace doors. Inside the library came sounds of struggle, furniture overturned, rapid footsteps, a man shouting. Miss Marple remained seated only a moment longer, because she already knew before the lamp extinguished, knew before the scream. Human nature had arranged the entire scene too perfectly. When she entered the library moments later, Inspector Hewitt stood gripping Dr. Blackwell by the arm. The doctor's face was white with terror. Near the fireplace lay Adrian Vale, stunned but alive. Lucy gasped. "Dr. Blackwell?" The doctor stared helplessly around the room. "I had to know whether the document was there." Inspector Hewitt tightened his grip. "And Vale?" "He followed me." Adrian struggled upright painfully. "He tried to strike me with the poker." Blackwell covered his face. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Miss Marple looked at him quietly. "No," she said softly. "It began going wrong 20 years ago." Inspector Hewitt frowned. "But if Blackwell came searching tonight, then what exactly does that prove?" Miss Marple turned slowly toward the doctor. "It was time. At last," she said gently. "Dr. Blackwell must explain how Peter Vale truly died." For a long moment no one spoke. The library remained in disarray around them. Overturned chairs, scattered papers, firelight trembling uncertainly across the walls. Outside, mist pressed against the windows like pale smoke. Dr. Edward Blackwell sat heavily in the armchair beside the hearth, looking suddenly much older than before. Inspector Hewitt remained standing over him. "Well," he said sharply. The doctor lowered his head. "It was never meant to become murder." Miss Marple sighed very softly. "No murder ever is." Silence settled again. Then Blackwell began speaking. "It was 1947, he said quietly. The war had ended, but nothing felt settled yet. Europe was chaos. Property vanished everywhere. Records disappeared. Men returned home carrying things they ought not to have carried. The fire cracked softly. Colonel Ashcombe supervised recovered valuables. "Jewelry!" He swallowed. At first he justified it as temporary safekeeping. "Until greed intervened," said Miss Marple gently. Blackwell nodded weakly. Inspector Hewitt folded his arms. "And Peter Vale discovered this. He found discrepancies while reviewing inventories." Blackwell stared blankly into the flames. "He came to me first, because I was the only person in Willowbrook he trusted completely." Vale stood motionless near the window. Miss Marple glanced briefly toward him. Not anger, not surprise, only old grief finally receiving shape. "What did Peter intend?" she asked softly. "To report everything." Blackwell closed his eyes. "He said surviving families deserved the truth. And Colonel Ashcombe?" Terrified. The doctor's voice shook faintly. "Exposure would destroy him. Prison, perhaps. Public disgrace." Inspector Hewitt said grimly, "So Ashcombe killed Peter." Blackwell looked up sharply. "No." The room became still. Miss Marple had expected that answer. "Then who?" asked Hewitt. For several seconds Blackwell said nothing. Then, at last, "I did." Lucy gave a soft cry of horror. Vale's face went completely white. The doctor covered his eyes briefly. "I told myself it was to protect everyone." "Harriet." His voice cracked. "My sister loved Peter desperately. Exposure would ruin the village, ruin all of us. Miss Marple watched him sadly. No greed, no cruelty, merely weakness. And weakness, she reflected, had caused nearly as much suffering in the world as evil itself. "How?" asked Inspector Hewitt quietly. Blackwell swallowed hard. "There was an old quarry path Peter used for climbing." He stared at his hands. "I loosened the safety anchor beforehand. He fell the next afternoon," Lucy whispered, "and everyone believed it was accidental." Vale spoke for the first time. "My brother trusted you." Blackwell flinched as though struck. The single word carried 20 years of guilt within it. Miss Marple moved quietly toward the fireplace. "Mistress Ashcombe eventually learned the truth," she said. Blackwell nodded slowly. "She guessed after Colonel Ashcombe died. Later I confessed it entirely. And she protected you." Inspector Hewitt frowned. "Then why kill her now?" Blackwell looked genuinely bewildered. "I didn't." Miss Marple believed him. Not because he deserved belief, but because his guilt belonged to an older crime. Mrs. Ashcombe's murder required a different emotional shape entirely. "Beatrice Ashcombe became frightened recently," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Not merely of scandal, but of exposure from someone actively pressuring her." "Pike," muttered Hewitt. Blackwell nodded miserably. "He demanded money repeatedly, said he would reveal everything." "And Harriet knew this?" "Partly." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Your sister hated Mrs. Ashcombe because she believed Beatrice responsible for Peter's death. But when Pike's pressure intensified, Harriet began suspecting another truth." The doctor stared at her. "She confronted me 2 nights before Beatrice died. There it was, at last, the fatal turning point." "What happened?" asked Lucy quietly. Blackwell looked exhausted beyond words. "She accused Beatrice again, said Peter had been betrayed." His voice trembled faintly. "And then she looked at me." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She realized. The doctor buried his face briefly in his hands. She didn't say it aloud, but she knew. Inspector Hewitt spoke sharply. "So Harriet discovered you killed Peter Vale, and afterward Mrs. Ashcombe died." Blackwell looked up desperately. "But not by me." Miss Marple's gaze remained calm. "No," she said softly, "not by you." Vale stared at her. "Then who?" At last Miss Marple turned from the fire. The moment had come. "My dear Mr. Vale," she said gently, "tell me, when did you first realize your brother's death was not accidental?" Vale hesitated. "Years ago." "But not immediately?" "No." "You returned to Willowbrook because Mrs. Ashcombe contacted you, and because you already suspected Dr. Blackwell." A long silence followed. Then Adrian Vale said quietly. Inspector Hewitt frowned. "What does that matter?" Miss Marple looked at him. "It matters because Adrian Vale arrived in Willowbrook already carrying suspicion, grief, and anger." She turned back toward Vale. "You intended to confront Mrs. Ashcombe with the truth about Peter, but instead you discovered Leonard Pike blackmailing her." Vale's expression hardened. "He disgusted me." "Indeed." Miss Marple walked slowly toward the tea-tray still standing forgotten upon the side table. "And on the afternoon of the fete," she continued softly, "you came to Ashcombe Hall before anyone realized." Inspector Hewitt stared. Good God! Adrian Vale's face had become expressionless. Miss Marple lifted the silver teapot gently. Elsie Turner prepared tea and left the tray unattended briefly in the pantry. "You passed through there after speaking with Mrs. Blackwell. Vale did not move, and you carried cyanide," Lucy whispered. "No!" Miss Marple's eyes rested sadly upon him. "You intended only to frighten Mrs. Ashcombe at first, to force confession perhaps. But then you saw opportunity. The room had gone utterly still. You poisoned the tea." Inspector Hewitt stepped forward sharply. Vale laughed once under his breath. A terrible sound. "You make it sound very neat." "Murder seldom is," said Miss Marple gently. His expression finally cracked. "You think I regretted it?" he whispered. "She protected the man who murdered Peter for 20 years. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "And that is precisely why you killed her." The silence deepened. Then Inspector Hewitt said quietly, "And Harriet Blackwell?" Vale closed his eyes briefly. She realized afterward. Miss Marple nodded. Harriet understood Mrs. Ashcombe's death had not been Dr. Blackwell's doing. She began suspecting someone else. "She came to meet me in the churchyard," Vale said hoarsely. "She wanted the truth." Lucy stared in horror. "And you poisoned her too?" "No." His voice broke. "She threatened to go to police. I panicked." Miss Marple's face grew infinitely sad. "How?" "She slipped while we argued near the yews." He swallowed hard. She struck her head on the stone border. Inspector Hewitt stared. "My God!" "She was still breathing," Vale whispered. "But I thought—" His voice failed. "I thought she would expose everything." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "And so you arranged the poison beside her?" Only the fire moved now. Vale looked suddenly exhausted beyond endurance. "I waited 20 years imagining justice," he said quietly. "And when it finally came, it was uglier than hatred itself." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "My dear Mr. Vale," she said softly, "revenge nearly always disappoints people. That is why it remains so popular." The following evening a small gathering assembled in the drawing-room at the vicarage. Inspector Hewitt had requested it officially. Reverend Dane disliked it morally. Lucy found it unbearably dramatic. Miss Marple, however, considered such occasions useful. Truth, she reflected, was best arranged carefully before people began improving it. Rain tapped softly against the windows once more, though the violence of the previous storms had passed. Lamps glowed warmly across the room, lending an almost domestic comfort to circumstances that were anything but comfortable. Dr. Blackwell sat pale and exhausted near the fireplace under police supervision. Vale occupied a chair by the window, his face unreadable now that the struggle of concealment had ended. Lucy poured tea because English people invariably required tea during catastrophes. Miss Marple accepted a cup with gratitude. Inspector Hewitt cleared his throat. "I believe," he said awkwardly, "that Miss Marple wishes to explain the matter completely." "My dear Inspector," said Miss Marple gently, "murder explanations are always untidy. Human beings rarely arrange themselves properly." Nevertheless, she folded her hands and began. "The entire tragedy," she said, "really began during the war, though perhaps one might say it began much earlier with weakness." Dr. Blackwell lowered his eyes. "Colonel Ashcombe stole valuables passing through military recovery channels after the war. Jewelry, records, and other property that should have been returned to surviving owners." She glanced toward Reverend Dane. "Not uncommon to surviving owners." She glanced toward Reverend Dane. "Not uncommon, unfortunately. Large disruptions often tempt ordinary people into extraordinary dishonesty." The vicar nodded sadly. "Peter Vale discovered the theft while reviewing inventories at Ashcombe Hall in 1947. Vale remained motionless. He intended exposure. Dr. Blackwell, frightened for his friends and terrified of scandal, sabotaged the quarry anchor Peter relied upon. Lucy shivered faintly. Miss Marple continued softly. "Peter's death was ruled accidental, but its shadow remained over everyone involved. Colonel Ashcombe died shortly afterward. Mrs. Ashcombe inherited both the stolen property and the knowledge of what had truly happened." Inspector Hewitt added grimly, "And Leonard Pike eventually uncovered the secret through legal records." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "At first Mr. Pike merely protected Mrs. Ashcombe. But years passed, financial pressures increased, temptation appeared. Blackmail," muttered Hewitt. She looked toward Adrian Vale. "Then Mrs. Ashcombe contacted Peter's brother. Perhaps from guilt, perhaps from fear, possibly both," Vale said quietly. "She wanted to confess." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but confession is difficult for people who have hidden things too long." A silence followed. "Harriet Blackwell," Miss Marple continued, "believed Mrs. Ashcombe responsible for Peter's death. Her resentment lasted 20 years. Yet resentment alone does not create murder." Lucy frowned slightly. "But everyone thought Harriet poisoned Mrs. Ashcombe." "Precisely," said Miss Marple, "which is why the real murderer encouraged that belief." She set down her teacup carefully. "On the third afternoon Harriet quarreled openly with Mrs. Ashcombe. Elsie overheard accusations and anger. Very memorable anger." Inspector Hewitt nodded slowly. "A perfect distraction." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Meanwhile, Adrian Vale, already suspicious and emotionally desperate after years of grief, passed through the pantry where the tea stood unattended. Vale closed his eyes briefly. "The poison entered the tea then," Lucy whispered, "and everyone naturally suspected Harriet afterward." "Indeed." Miss Marple sighed softly. "Villagers are particularly vulnerable to emotional explanations. They prefer dramatic motives to patient observation." Inspector Hewitt frowned. "But what first made you doubt Harriet?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Several things. To begin with, Mrs. Ashcombe was alive after Harriet left the morning-room." The inspector blinked. "Elsie's statement." "Anything else?" "My dear Inspector, women who preserve grievances for 20 years do not suddenly commit impulsive poisoning immediately after loud arguments. They become controlled. Cold perhaps, but not careless. Reverend Dane looked thoughtful. You trusted psychology over appearances. One must. Appearances are frequently designed. She turned toward Adrian Vale again. Mr. Vale intended justice, but grief unfortunately behaves very badly when mixed with opportunity. Vale stared into the darkness beyond the window. I told myself it was for Peter. Yes, said Miss Marple quietly. Most revenge begins by pretending it serves the dead. The room grew still. Inspector Hewitt leaned forward. There's one thing I still don't fully understand. Yes? The cupboard? A faint smile touched Miss Marple's face.
Ah, yes.
The famous cupboard. Even Lucy laughed softly despite herself. It mattered enormously, Miss Marple continued, but not for the reason everyone imagined. She folded her hands. The cupboard originally concealed the existence of hidden storage within the room. Colonel Ashcombe used it to hide the dispatch box temporarily after the war. And later, asked Hewitt? Later the hidden compartment became almost symbolic. Miss Marple glanced toward Dr. Blackwell. Everyone associated it with guilt, fear, and secrecy. Mrs. Ashcombe locked it obsessively because it represented the entire buried past. The doctor spoke faintly. She said once that if the cupboard opened, everything would. Miss Marple nodded. And the real hiding place, said Lucy slowly, was the fireplace recess all along. Precisely. Inspector Hewitt exhaled heavily. Good Lord, we spent days staring at the wrong thing. My dear Inspector, said Miss Marple kindly, human beings usually do. Murderers depend upon it. Rain whispered softly against the windows. For several moments no one spoke. Then Reverend Dane said quietly, What a terrible waste! Miss Marple looked sadly toward the fire. And that, she thought, was always the truest thing one could say about murder. Not horror, not evil. Waste. Lives wasted through fear, greed, pride, resentment, and the stubborn refusal to confess unpleasant truths before they poisoned everything around them. At last Inspector Hewitt rose. I suppose, he said heavily, that concludes matters. Miss Marple looked toward Adrian Vale. No, she said softly. There remains one final sadness. Adrian. Vale was taken from the vicarage shortly after midnight. He went quietly. No dramatic declarations. No final de niels. Merely the exhausted stillness of a man who had pursued revenge so long that he no longer remembered what peace might have felt like without it. As the police motor-car disappeared into the rain-dark lane, Lucy stood beside the drawing-room window with folded arms. I almost pity him, she said softly. Miss Marple adjusted the wool upon her knitting needles. One should pity nearly everyone connected with murder, she replied gently. Even the guilty. Lucy looked troubled. But he killed 2 people. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. And Dr. Blackwell killed Peter Vale years earlier. Leonard Pike preyed upon fear for profit. Mrs. Ashcombe protected lies because truth frightened her. She sighed faintly. Human beings are rarely consistent enough to be entirely villains or entirely innocent. The younger woman sat slowly near the fire. Is that why murder is so difficult to understand? My dear, said Miss Marple, murder is usually quite easy to understand. That is what makes it alarming. Outside, rain drifted softly through the sleeping village. At last the long strain seemed to be lifting from Willowbrook, and yet Miss Marple herself remained thoughtful, because one thing still lingered unresolved, not legally, emotionally, the final sadness. 2 days later, Peter Vale was buried properly, or rather remembered properly. Reverend Dane arranged a small memorial service in St. Jude's churchyard near the grave that had stood almost forgotten for 20 years. The entire village attended. Not from kindness alone, Miss Marple reflected. Villagers possessed a deep instinct for witnessing the end of stories. They liked matters concluded publicly. Gray clouds moved slowly overhead while damp winds stirred among the yews. Dr. Blackwell, under official supervision, had been permitted to attend briefly. He looked frail now, smaller somehow. Guilt aged people more quickly than illness. Adrian Vale was absent, already transferred to London custody. Lucy stood beside Miss Marple, holding a small cluster of white flowers. It feels strange, she whispered. Do you think Peter Vale would have wanted all this uncovered? Miss Marple considered carefully. I think he wanted honesty. The service was simple. A hymn, several prayers. Then Reverend Dane spoke quietly about truth, forgiveness, and the danger of hidden wrongs left to grow in silence. Miss Marple noticed many villagers avoiding Dr. Blackwell's eyes. Condemnation came easily to communities once guilt became official. Perhaps too easily. Afterward, as people slowly dispersed among the graves, Dr. Blackwell approached Miss Marple alone. For a moment neither spoke. Then he said quietly, "I used to tell myself I protected everyone." Miss Marple looked at him gently. "But really I protected myself. The honesty of it seemed to cost him dearly." Rainwater gleamed faintly upon the doctor's coat sleeve. "I love my sister very much," he said after a pause.
"I know."
"And all these years she hated the wrong person." Miss Marple folded her gloved hands together. "My dear doctor, hatred almost always harms the person carrying it most." He gave a broken little smile. "She would have married Peter. And instead—" His voice failed. Miss Marple regarded him sadly. "Yes," she said softly. "Instead everything spoiled. That was another thing murder did. Not merely ending lives, spoiling them. Spoiling memories, affections, futures, even ordinary places until people could no longer look at them without remembering pain." Dr. Blackwell lowered his head. "I don't expect forgiveness." "No," said Miss Marple gently, "nor should you ask for it too quickly." He nodded once, then, without another word, walked slowly away through the graves beneath the yew trees. An old man at last. A week later Willowbrook began returning to itself. The fete bunting finally came down. The Bluebell Inn resumed ordinary arguments about rationing and cricket. Mrs. Finch discovered fresh scandals entirely unrelated to murder. Life persisted stubbornly, as it always did. Life persisted stubbornly, as it always did. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage garden one bright afternoon while Lucy read aloud from the newspaper account of the case. "They're calling it the Ashcombe Hall murders," Lucy said. "How unimaginative. There's also a great deal about hidden wartime jewels." "Yes," murmured Miss Marple. "People enjoy treasure. It distracts them from human weakness." Lucy lowered the paper. "You sound disappointed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, there was never any real mystery about the jewels. The mystery was why so many people chose silence when honesty might have saved them years of suffering." A bee drifted lazily among the roses. Far away church bells sounded the hour. Lucy studied her thoughtfully. "Do these things ever upset you?" "Murder?" Miss Marple's knitting slowed.
"Oh, yes."
Lucy seemed surprised. "But you always appear so calm." "My dear child," said Miss Marple quietly, "one learns calmness because the alternative becomes exhausting." For a moment neither spoke. Then Lucy asked softly, "And the cupboard?" Miss Marple laughed unexpectedly. "The cupboard was rather absurd in the end." "But important." She looked toward the summer sky thoughtfully. "People often do that, you know." "Do what?" "Turn ordinary objects into containers for fear." Lucy considered this. The cupboard wasn't really hiding documents anymore. "No," said Miss Marple gently. "It was hiding guilt." The afternoon sunlight warmed the garden walls. Somewhere nearby a child laughed beyond the hedge. And at last, truly at last, Willowbrook began breathing again. Miss Marple resumed her knitting peacefully. For murder, however terrible, eventually passed. But human nature remained. And in villages especially, human nature was always quietly waiting behind lace curtains, teacups, garden gates, and sometimes behind locked cupboard doors. August arrived gently over Willowbrook. The fierce emotions stirred by murder had faded into softer recollections now, becoming the sort of story villagers lowered their voices to discuss over tea tables and garden walls. Ashcombe Hall remained shuttered while legal matters continued in London, and the great house stood silent beneath climbing ivy and drifting summer sunlight. Miss Marple thought the silence suited it. Some houses after tragedy seemed almost grateful for emptiness. On a warm afternoon she sat with Lucy Dane beneath the apple trees at the vicarage. Bees moved lazily among the flowers, and somewhere nearby Reverend Dane struggled unsuccessfully with a lawn-mower that sounded increasingly theological in its distress. Lucy folded a letter thoughtfully. "You've received another invitation."
"Have I?"
"Mrs. Bantry wants you to stay in St. Mary Mead for a fortnight." "How dangerous!" Lucy laughed. "I suspect danger follows you rather than places." "My dear," said Miss Marple mildly, "danger follows human beings. Villages merely provide convenient scenery." For several moments they listened to the summer quiet. Then Lucy said softly, "Will Willowbrook ever entirely forget?" Miss Marple's knitting slowed. "No." "Is that sad?" "Not entirely." She looked toward the distant trees. "People ought to remember certain things. Otherwise they repeat them with terrible enthusiasm." Lucy smiled faintly. "You always make humanity sound exhausting." "It is exhausting," said Miss Marple cheerfully. That is why gardening is so restorative. The younger woman hesitated. I still think about Adrian Vale sometimes. Miss Marple nodded gently. He loved his brother very much, and yet— Yes, said Miss Marple quietly. And yet, that was always the tragedy. Love itself rarely prevented destruction. Sometimes it caused it. Later that week, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Elsie Turner arrived at the vicarage carrying a parcel wrapped carefully in brown paper. "You've left Ashcombe Hall?" Miss Marple asked kindly. "Yes, miss." "And found somewhere suitable?" "I've taken a position in Medchester." "Very sensible." Elsie smiled nervously and held out the parcel. "This was discovered during clearing upstairs. Mrs. Pollard thought perhaps you should have it." Miss Marple accepted the package curiously. Inside lay an old wooden box. Lucy frowned. "But I thought the police recovered everything." "They did," said Miss Marple softly. "This box contained no jewels, no documents, only letters, dozens of them, tied neatly with faded blue ribbon." Miss Marple opened one carefully, then another, and another. Lucy watched her face change slowly from curiosity into sadness. "What are they?" Miss Marple handed one over silently. Lucy read several lines before going very still. "They're Harriet Blackwell's. Letters written over many years. Letters never sent. To Peter Vale. Some dated before the war. Others afterward. Some written long after his death." Lucy's eyes filled faintly with tears. "She kept writing to him." Miss Marple nodded. "People continue conversations with the dead surprisingly often." One letter slipped free onto Miss Marple's lap. The handwriting trembled slightly. "If I knew the truth entirely, perhaps I could forgive someone. But not knowing poisons everything." Miss Marple closed the letter gently. There it was, the entire tragedy reduced to one simple truth. Not knowing poisons everything. Half-truths. All the things people preserved in order to avoid pain eventually created far greater pain themselves, Lucy whispered. "How terrible!" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "but also very human." That evening Miss Marple walked alone through Willowbrook one final time before her departure for St. Mary Mead. The village glowed peacefully beneath the golden light of sunset. Cottage windows stood open to warm air. Roses spilled across garden walls. Somewhere a piano played faintly and badly. Ordinary life. She passed the churchyard gates slowly. Peter Vale's grave rested beneath the yews now freshly tended, white flowers bright against the dark earth. Miss Marple paused there quietly, not from sentimentality. She distrusted excessive sentiment, but because it seemed right somehow that someone should stand there a moment remembering the cost of silence. After a time she continued walking. At the end of Church Lane she turned once toward distant Ashcombe Hall. The windows reflected the setting sun like pale fire. A house full of hidden things, yet not hidden any longer. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Human beings always imagine truth difficult to uncover. Usually it waited patiently in plain sight, hidden beneath politeness, pride, fear, or behind some absurd little cupboard door no one wished to open. And as the evening bells of St. Jude's drifted softly across Willowbrook, Miss Jane Marple walked home through the summer dusk with her knitting bag resting lightly upon her arm. The mystery at last was over.